Terrorism. Never before in our history has the need for watchfulness been so great. Terrorism is not only an attack using weapons of mass destruction or chemicals, but also includes weapons of viruses, bacteria, and other germs. This form of terrorism is called bioterrorism. The effects of an attack using chemicals or radiation would be immediate and therefore need to be acted upon quickly. But many critical hours or even days could silently go by before we might know about the devastating effects of an attack using a dangerous disease-causing germ. The diseases that could be used by terrorists are divided into different categories, A through C. The videos you will find on the CDC website describe the Category A diseases, which include smallpox, anthrax, botulism, plague, tularemia, and viral hemorrhagic fevers. If these germs were used to intentionally infect people, they would cause the most illness and death. Some of them can be spread through air, others can be spread through water or food supplies. Diseases such as plague and smallpox were long ago used as weapons by mankind. More recently, anthrax was intentionally used in the United States, leading to several deaths and creating widespread panic. You do not need to live your life in constant fear of bioterrorism attacks. Remaining vigilant means being prepared. The United States government has taken important measures to put into place preparedness and response plans. These plans can be found on websites such as www.ready.gov. At the end of this presentation, you will find local and national contact information on being prepared, as well as information about bioterrorism. The idea of using disease as a weapon gained a new level of sophistication in the early 1930s as nationally funded research programs on biological warfare were developed. The Japanese had a very active offensive biowarfare research program which included a battalion known as 731. In their program, the Japanese conducted experiments on humans using 15 to 20 different disease-causing agents, with anthrax being one of their favorites. Allied prisoners of war and innocent Manchurian civilians in nearby villages provided an almost endless supply of experimental subjects. When word of Unit 731 leaked to the West, Allied forces began their own programs, concerned that Japan and possibly Germany would gain a military advantage in biowarfare research.
On the third day after exposure, the casualties begin. Dead sheep can be seen further down the line. It is, of course, necessary to confirm that they've died of anthrax.
In 1942, on Greenyard Island off the coast of Scotland, the British conducted their first scientifically controlled biowarfare field trials. Scientists exploded anthrax bombs near immobilized sheep to determine if the spores would survive an explosion and retain the ability to infect anyone nearby. Test results showed that anthrax could in fact be effectively dispersed by explosive devices and could also remain viable in the soil for decades. This brought home the realization that if an anthrax bomb were dropped on a city like London, the results could have been catastrophic. Greenyard Island was declared off-limits until it was decontaminated in the 1980s. It's now safe for both humans and animals. Like our allies, the United States responded to the perceived threats from Germany and Japan. In 1943, we began an offensive biological program with a modest research and development facility at Camp Detrick, which is now Fort Detrick, Maryland. By the end of the program, we had weaponized a total of 7 incapacitating or lethal human agents, including anthrax. In 1969, Richard Nixon renounced the use of biological weapons for the United States.
I have decided that the United States of America will renounce the use of any form of deadly biological weapons that either kill or incapacitate.
President Nixon visited Fort Detrick on the 25th of November, 1969. I remember that date quite well because following his announcement of taking munitions and beating them to plowsheds, we all lost our job. And that was a very traumatic experience. But following his presidential announcement on this date, the entire United States offensive program on biological warfare came to a close within 2 years. We destroyed all of our seed stocks. We destroyed all of our production material at Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And we completely got out of the biological warfare business.
Even at its peak, the U.S. offensive program paled compared to the Soviet Union's. The Soviets had a massive, extensive, sophisticated, top-secret program which employed tens of thousands of scientists and engineers in numerous research and production facilities. The Soviets signed the Biological Warfare Convention in the 1970s, and yet their program continued uninterrupted and, in fact, intensified. Our worst fears were confirmed in 1979 when an accidental release of anthrax occurred at a biological research facility in the town of Sverdlovsk. Much of our recent knowledge about their joint military and civilian program comes from a Soviet defector, Dr. Ken Alibek, formerly known as Dr. Kenachin Alibekov. He was the deputy director of Bioterrorism, a cover organization for the civilian bioweapon and production facilities. Although we had suspected for years that they had continued their offensive program, some of the information he provided was a real wake-up call for the United States. Prior to the Gulf War, the intelligence community suspected that the Iraqis had done research on anthrax, but they didn't know just how extensive their program was. So as a precautionary measure during the war, about 150,000 U.S. service members were vaccinated against anthrax. And more would have been immunized if the war hadn't ended so quickly. After the war, the Iraqis admitted to producing and weaponizing anthrax, although the weapons were never used. This past decade, anthrax moved from being an agent of concern for biological warfare to the top of the threat list for terrorism. The Shurikium truth cult in Japan, which released the nerve agent sarin from the Tokyo subway in 1995, allegedly made multiple unsuccessful attempts to infect people with anthrax. In October of 2001, the United States experienced anthrax attacks using powder sent through the United States Postal Service. 22 people got sick and 5 people died from this attack. We learned just how dangerous anthrax could be. But there are things we can do. The best defense against a bioterrorism attack is knowledge and preparation. The webpage ready.gov is a good resource for preparedness information. It can be found at www.ready.gov. Visit this webpage for detailed guidelines, facts, and what you can do to be ready in the event of an emergency. A small amount of time spent becoming informed, developing a plan, and preparing yourself against terrorist threats now can prove to be invaluable should the need arise. Don't be afraid. Be ready. Man has used organisms found in nature to kill or disable his enemies since the Middle Ages. One of the earlier examples occurred in the 14th century when the Tartar army laid siege to Kaffa, a walled city along the Black Sea. When an outbreak of bubonic plague began to ravage the Tartars, they decided to catapult the plague-ridden corpses into the city, thereby helping to start an outbreak within the walls. Shortly thereafter, the Genoese defenders within the city were stricken with plague and fled to Italy. They carried this infection with them to Europe, beginning the outbreak of the horrible Black Death, which decimated the European population. With our current knowledge of the epidemiology of plague, we know that fleas leave a body quickly after it cools. Therefore, it's most likely that the outbreak was actually spread in Kaffa by flea-infested rats which were already within the city. The Japanese Imperial Unit 731 operated in the 1930s and 40s when Japan was mobilized and ready for war. General Shiro Ishii, mastermind of this terrible program, had a mission to turn illness into weapons of murder. Ishii was particularly fascinated by plague because with plague, a biological warfare attack could present like a natural epidemic. Person-to-person spread could then produce disease out of proportion to the original amount of agent used. The Japanese were unable to disseminate plague by either aerosol or in the water supply, so they used nature's vector for spreading the disease, the common flea. Ceramic bombs loaded with infected fleas were dropped over several cities in mainland China, causing large outbreaks among their population. Plague is attractive as a weapon because it generates fear, it spreads easily, and it kills very quickly. The United States Offensive Program did some research on plague, but it was never fully weaponized in this country. We could not overcome the challenge of maintaining virulence when it was grown in large quantities.
It's a weapon that, it's a contagious agent, and we felt that in retrospect that we had enough problems controlling an aerosol under meteorological conditions that can change without having an organism that is so contagious so that you're not able to control where that organism might end up. It might come back to bite you, not only bite your forces but some of your friendly allied forces also.
Plague was, however, a favorite organism in the Soviet arsenal because of its communicability. The Soviets overcame the virulence problems experienced by the U.S. According to interviews with the Soviet defector, Dr. Alibek, they had 1,500 metric tons of plague on hand at any given time and kept it ready for use in their intercontinental ballistic missiles. Due to storage problems, they frequently recycled their stockpile of plague with fresh agent. We're very concerned about terrorist use of plague because the agent is found not only in nature, but also in numerous biological supply houses throughout the world. Before the discovery of the smallpox vaccine, smallpox was in fact used as a weapon. One of the best documented examples of this occurred during the French and Indian War. The British had been defeated in their attempt to conquer Fort Carillon on Lake Champlain, so Sir Geoffrey Amherst, commander of the British forces, met with Indians who were sympathetic to the French. Under the pretense of friendship, he deliberately offered them blankets previously used by smallpox victims. The Indians, who lacked immunity to smallpox, suffered a devastating outbreak of the disease. The English were then able to successfully attack the fort, which, by the way, was renamed Fort Ticonderoga. Military forces have also been devastated by endemic smallpox. During the siege of Quebec, George Washington's troops suffered massive losses from smallpox. He subsequently required all new recruits to be inoculated against the virus.
I'd like to comment for a few minutes on the Soviet program and their development of smallpox, variola major. They first worked with smallpox and immunized chicken eggs. And since a very small amount of material is produced in the egg, you can imagine the large numbers of eggs that were required to produce 100 metric tons of dried agent. Now, as their program advanced, and starting in the early 90s, they were using tissue culture as a means of generating the virus. But 100 metric tons loaded into an ICBM aimed at our major cities is cause for worry.
It's incredibly ironic that the great public health triumph of eradicating smallpox in the 1970s and the discontinuation of worldwide vaccination have opened the door for this virus to be once again used as a weapon. Botulinum toxin is the most lethal substance known to man, so its potential as a weapon was appreciated early on. Supporters of Pancho Villa may have used botulinum against Mexican federales in 1910. While the details are unclear, it's been said that they left behind recipes where they actually buried pork and green beans for several days. They then dug up this horrible concoction and used it to contaminate food, and they also smeared it on sharp instruments that they used as weapons. During the Second World War, intelligence reports indicated that the Germans were developing botulinum toxin as a cross-English Channel weapon to be used against invasion forces. In light of this, it's ironic that a hand grenade filled with botulinum toxins may have been used by Czech patriots who were trained and equipped by the British to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Nazi Gestapo, in 1942. Inconclusive reports suggested that he died from the effects of the toxin rather than injuries sustained from the shrapnel. The United States' interest in botulinum toxins may have grown in part out of our suspicions about the alleged German program. The Soviets studied botulinum as well. While the U.S. actually developed botulinum as one of the lethal agents in its arsenal, both the United States and the Soviets ultimately gave botulinum a lower level of priority. Botulinum's usefulness for dissemination over large areas was inferior to that of other agents like anthrax and tularemia. Botulinum appears to have been Saddam Hussein's favorite biological weapon. According to United Nations documents, Iraq produced 19,000 liters of liquid botulinum toxins and 8,500 liters of liquid anthrax. Much of this was loaded into bombs, and Saddam was apparently fully prepared to use these weapons. Obtaining the bacterial cultures for production of botulinum toxins was unfortunately relatively easy for the Iraqis.
The Iraqis got the culture that they used for weaponization from a supply house in the United States, and they selected the same culture that we had weaponized back in the 40s and early 50s. So by getting this culture from the supply house, we saved them a lot of time and energy and effort because they didn't have to go out and search for a very strong toxin producer.
Botulinum toxins aren't great open-air biological warfare weapons because of their limited range and relative instability, but terrorists could potentially use the toxins effectively in enclosed areas or to contaminate food supplies. Ebola strikes fear in the hearts of people who hear the word. Movies have been made about the dreadful outcome of becoming infected with Ebola. But it's just one of several deadly hemorrhagic fever viruses that can be used as a weapon against mankind. There are many types of viruses in the world, some more deadly than others. Some viruses cause mild colds, while other viruses cause severe illness and death. The viral hemorrhagic fever viruses are of great concern. These viruses cause internal and external bleeding in people who get infected. Viral hemorrhagic fever is caused by 4 families of viruses. You can find more information about these families and their viruses under resources following this presentation. They include Ebola, Marburg, Lassa fever, yellow fever, and a few others.
None of the viral hemorrhagic fever viruses occur naturally in the United States. Although with travel becoming easier and more common, an outbreak of these viruses is a growing possibility. Like we've seen with SARS and monkeypox, new viruses can easily enter our country. The way that hemorrhagic fever viruses spread varies according to the type of virus. You can get some of these viruses by being in close contact with people or animals that are infectious, or by being bitten by an infected insect.
Some of these viruses may have been around for a long time. 1/3 of Athenians lost their lives to a mysterious plague in 431 BC. Some historians believe that Ebola may have been the disease that was described as the cause of all these deaths during war in ancient Greece.
Hemorrhagic fever viruses are worrisome as possible biological weapons because they spread so easily. Infection can be transmitted by direct contact with infectious body fluids or by infectious droplets that reach the mucous membranes of your nose, eyes, or mouth. Ebola has caused devastating outbreaks in several parts of Africa, killing entire families as well as nurses and doctors working in hospitals. A recent outbreak in the Republic of Congo caused hundreds of deaths and froze travel and commerce in large parts of the country. Other hemorrhagic fever viruses, including the ones that cause Lassa fever, Rift Valley fever, and Congo-Crimean hemorrhagic fever, have caused large outbreaks that killed people and, in some cases, livestock. Marburg virus, a close relative of Ebola, is already known to have been developed as a weapon.
A terrorist attack using any of these viruses in a populated area could result in mass illness and many deaths. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and other agencies are staying alert to the possibility of attacks using these hemorrhagic fever viruses. Our partnership with health departments and physicians is critical to quickly identifying even a single case of one of these diseases in the U.S. We continue to be prepared to deal with the possibility of a large outbreak, but it's always best to contain an outbreak quickly before it grows out of control. First described as a plague-like illness in the United States in 1911, a new bacteria infecting ground squirrels was discovered in Tulare County, California, hence its name tularemia. This disease, which affects mostly small animals, is frequently associated with sick rabbits, so it was described also as rabbit fever. There are several ways that people can get infected: being bitten by a blood-sucking insect such as a tick or deer fly, by handling meat and skins of infected animals, from food or water that has been contaminated, or by breathing in the bacteria. Cases of tularemia happen naturally in the environment, but cases have also happened in laboratory settings where the disease has been studied. Tularemia is not known to spread from person to person, but it has been studied as a biological weapon because it could be used to contaminate food and water, and because it does not require many organisms to infect a person. As with the use of plague, the Japanese also used tularemia in their biological warfare program. General Ishii used it in experiments against the people of Manchuria before World War II. The goal was to create ways to infect as many people as possible at one time. Historians estimate that over 200,000 Chinese were killed in germ warfare field experiments. The World Health Organization once estimated that 50 kilograms of tularemia spread through the air over a city of 5 million people would lead to 250,000 cases of illness. 19,000 of these sick people would die. Illness from tularemia would be expected to last for several weeks. However, relapses can occur during the following weeks and even months.
Tularemia is not a household name like plague is. However, it is potentially a dangerous disease that could be used as a weapon. Tularemia bacteria can be mixed into food and water supplies and then taken in by unsuspecting persons. Bacteria that is sprayed into the air is also a concern. In 1994, it was removed from the list of diseases that doctors are required to report when they occur. Because of the potential danger that tularemia poses to mankind, it was placed back on the reportable list of diseases in 2000. Tularemia is also classified as a Category A agent. This means that it is one of the critical agents of concern to us from a bioterrorism perspective. Tularemia was included in the United States stockpile of biological weapons in the late 1960s. Dr. Ken Alabek is a Soviet Union weapons defector who provided much information about the biological weapons programs in his country. He has indicated that his country and the United States held similar studies trying to engineer tularemia strains that would be resistant to antibiotics and vaccines. The United States ended its development of such weapons in the early 1970s.
It's important for doctors to recognize the symptoms and how it spread. This early recognition would prevent a disaster if this disease were introduced into our food or water supply. We're very concerned about terrorists using tularemia. The disease agent is found not only in nature, but can also be purchased from commercial sources for legitimate scientific research. Although tularemia may be obtained from other parts of the world where its transfer is not well regulated, access to this bacteria is under tight control in the United States. Using a dangerous disease-causing germ. The diseases that could be used by terrorists are divided into different categories, A through C. The videos you will find on the CDC website describe the Category A diseases, which include smallpox, anthrax, botulism, plague, tularemia, and viral hemorrhagic fevers. If these germs were used to intentionally infect people, they would cause the most illness and death. Some of them can be spread through air, others can be spread through water or food supplies. Diseases such as plague. Terrorism. Never before in our history has the need for watchfulness been so great. Terrorism is not only an attack using weapons of mass destruction or chemicals, but also includes weapons of viruses, bacteria, and other germs. This form of terrorism is called bioterrorism. The effects of an attack using chemicals or radiation would be immediate and therefore need to be acted upon quickly. But many critical hours or even days could silently go by before we might know about the devastating effects of an attack. You will find local and national contact information on being prepared, as well as information about bioterrorism. The idea of using disease as a weapon gained a new level of sophistication in the early 1930s, as and smallpox were long ago used as weapons by mankind. More recently, anthrax was intentionally used in the United States, leading to several deaths and creating widespread panic. You do not need to live your life in constant fear of bioterrorism attacks. Remaining vigilant means being prepared. The United States government has taken important measures to put into place preparedness and response plans. These plans can be found on websites such as www.ready.gov. At the end of this presentation, nationally funded research programs on biological warfare were developed. The Japanese had a very active offensive biowarfare research program, which included a battalion known as 731. In their program, the Japanese conducted experiments on humans using 15 to 20 different disease-causing agents, with anthrax being one of their favorites. Allied prisoners of war and innocent Manchurian civilians in nearby villages provided an almost endless supply of experimental subjects. When word of Unit 731 leaked to the West, Allied forces began their own program